Imagine a place where the sun becomes a weapon, where canvas walls trap heat like an oven, and metal bed frames reach temperatures that burn human skin on contact, where the air itself becomes so thick with heat that breathing feels like drowning in fire. In August 1993, Maricopa County, Arizona built a jail made entirely of military surplus tents. 48 canvas structures sitting on white gravel that reflected sunlight upward like mirrors. They called it Tent City, and they said it would save taxpayers millions of dollars while teaching criminals a lesson they'd never forget. For 24 years, this experiment ran continuously, through summers when interior temperatures exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit, through 4,700 documented medical emergencies caused by extreme heat, through federal investigations that documented systematic violations of the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The total cost? $800 million over 2 decades, more expensive than any maximum security prison ever built in American history. The human cost: 17 preventable deaths and thousands of inmates who suffered permanent health damage from chronic heat exposure that exceeded the limits of human survival. Today, we open the complete files on America's most expensive corrections experiment. The classified medical records, the hidden maintenance reports, the internal memos that reveal how administrators knew the system was failing but continued operating anyway. This is the forensic autopsy of Tent City, where the desert taught lessons that no one in authority wanted to learn, until physics finally forced them to listen. If you're fascinated by the intersection of human ambition and environmental reality, by stories where engineering meets hubris and physics always wins, then this investigation is for you. Welcome to the complete record of how America tried to weaponize the desert, and how the desert fought back. The Sonoran Desert doesn't forgive. At noon in July, when the sun hangs directly overhead like a white-hot anvil, the temperature climbs past 110 degrees. The air shimmers with heat so intense it bends light itself. Asphalt softens. Metal becomes untouchable. Even the lizards retreat underground. This is Phoenix, Arizona, a city of 4 million souls built in a place that was never meant to sustain human life. The Spanish called it El Desierto de la Muerte, the Desert of Death. Modern engineering conquered it with air conditioning and swimming pools, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. This land kills the unprepared. In 1993, Maricopa County decided to build a jail here. Not just any jail, a jail made of tents, canvas tents, military surplus canvas tents designed for temporary field operations, not permanent human habitation. They would house these tents on 30 acres of desert hardpan, where the white gravel reflected sunlight upward like a furnace floor. No air conditioning, no concrete walls, no thermal insulation of any kind. The man behind this vision was Sheriff Joe Arpaio. He called it Tent City. He called it the cheapest jail in America. He called it a deterrent. What he had actually created was something else entirely: a laboratory for testing the limits of human endurance against the raw physics of the Sonoran Desert. For 24 years, until 2017, this experiment ran continuously. Through summers when the heat index reached 130 degrees, through nights when the temperature never dropped below 95, through decades of lawsuits, federal investigations, and medical emergencies, the story of Tent City is not a story about crime and punishment. It is a story about what happens when human institutions try to weaponize the environment itself. The desert remembers everything. It remembers the first tent that went up in August 1993. It remembers the last one that came down in October 2017. It remembers every degree of heat, every night without sleep, every medical call for heat exhaustion. The desert keeps perfect records. This is that record. Phoenix sits in the Salt River Valley, a natural basin surrounded by mountains that trap heat like a clay oven. The city sprawls across 600 square miles of what was once pristine Sonoran Desert, home to saguaro cactus and roadrunners and creatures that evolved over millions of years to survive extreme heat. Human beings were not among them. The indigenous Hohokam people understood this land. They built their settlements near water sources. They worked in the cool hours before dawn. They knew that the desert demands respect, not conquest. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 16th century, they took one look at the endless expanse of thorns and rock and heat and called it uninhabitable. For 300 years, they were essentially right. Modern Phoenix exists because of two inventions: the electric air conditioner and the deep water well. Without these technologies, the metropolitan area that now houses nearly 5 million people would still be empty desert. But technology creates an illusion of control. Behind every climate-controlled building, beyond every irrigation system, the original desert waits, patient, unmoved, ready to reclaim what was taken. The Maricopa County jail system in 1993 was overcrowded and underfunded. The main facility, built in 1969 for 800 inmates, housed nearly 3,000. Federal regulations demanded either immediate expansion or immediate release of prisoners. Both options carried political costs that Sheriff Arpaio was unwilling to pay. Arpaio had been elected on a platform of being tough on crime. He understood that in Arizona, politics being seen as soft on criminals was career suicide. Traditional jail expansion would cost $40 million and take 3 years to complete. Even with federal mandates, the county commissioners were reluctant to approve such a massive expenditure. Arpaio needed a solution that was cheap, fast, and politically defensible. He found it in Army surplus catalogs. Military field tents, designed for temporary deployment of troops, were available for purchase at a fraction of the cost of permanent construction. These tents were built to house soldiers for weeks or months, not years. They consisted of canvas stretched over aluminum frames, with minimal insulation and no climate control. In temperate climates, with proper rotation schedules, they were adequate for their intended purpose. In the Sonoran Desert, they were something else entirely. But Arpaio saw opportunity where engineers saw impossibility. The tents could be erected in weeks, not years. They cost $600,000, not $40 million. And critically, from a political standpoint, they sent a clear message to voters. Criminals in Maricopa County would receive no luxuries, no comfort, no escape from the consequences of their actions. The desert itself would be their punishment. The site chosen for Tent City was a 30-acre parcel of county land adjacent to the main jail complex. It had been used for vehicle storage and equipment maintenance. The land was flat, exposed, and completely without natural shade. The ground was covered with white gravel, a surface chosen for its clean appearance and low maintenance requirements. What the planners failed to account for was the gravel's albedo effect, its ability to reflect sunlight upward, essentially turning the entire compound into a solar oven. No trees, no hills, no natural windbreaks. The site was a perfect heat trap, surrounded by asphalt parking lots and concrete buildings that absorbed solar energy during the day and radiated it back into the air at night. Even without tents, the location regularly measured 5 to 10 degrees hotter than the surrounding area. With canvas structures designed to trap air, those differences would multiply. The first engineering review, conducted by County Facilities Management, identified several critical concerns. Canvas tents would concentrate heat rather than dissipate it. The white gravel would create upward heat reflection that could raise interior temperatures by 15 to 20 degrees above ambient air temperature. The lack of permanent electrical infrastructure would require diesel generators for any cooling equipment, creating both noise and additional heat sources. The review recommended either relocating the project or installing permanent shade structures and electrical service. Sheriff Arpaio's office reviewed these findings and proceeded without modifications. The procurement process moved with unusual speed. In March 1993, the county purchased 48 military surplus tents from a government liquidation warehouse in Alabama. These were not specialized detention facilities. They were standard-issue field shelters designed for European theater operations during the Cold War. Each tent measured 16 feet by 32 feet and was rated to house 8 soldiers for temporary deployment. The canvas was olive drab, treated with chemical fire retardants that had been found to degrade in extreme heat and sunlight. The tents arrived in Phoenix by freight truck in early summer 1993. Assembly began immediately, despite the fact that June through August represents the most extreme heat period in the Sonoran Desert. Construction crews worked in 4-hour shifts, starting before dawn and ending by 10 in the morning to avoid heat exhaustion. Even with these precautions, 3 workers required medical attention for heat-related illness during the 5-week assembly period. Each tent was fitted with 8 metal bunk beds, creating capacity for 16 inmates per structure. The bunks were standard institutional steel, painted white to reflect heat, but lacking any insulation or heat-dissipating design. The math was straightforward. 48 tents multiplied by 16 beds equaled 768 additional detention spaces. At a total cost of just over $600,000, including site preparation and installation, the per-bed cost was less than $800. A comparable permanent facility would have cost approximately $52,000 per bed. The savings were undeniable. The safety margins were non-existent. Interior temperature testing conducted during the construction phase revealed that even empty tents reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit during afternoon hours in June. This was before peak summer heat. This was before the tents were occupied by human bodies generating additional thermal load. This was before the aluminum bed frames began absorbing and radiating solar energy. The test results were filed with the County Facilities Department and never released to the public. Portable evaporative cooling units were purchased and installed in each tent. These devices, commonly called swamp coolers, work by blowing air across water-soaked pads to create cooling through evaporation. They are effective in dry climates when ambient temperatures remain below 95 degrees. When temperatures exceed 100 degrees, evaporative cooling becomes ineffective and can actually increase humidity levels, making heat feel more oppressive rather than less. The cooling units installed in Tent City were rated for spaces up to 200 square feet. Each tent contained 512 square feet. The undersized equipment was supplemented with industrial fans that circulated hot air without cooling it. The electrical load required to run cooling units and fans in all 48 tents exceeded the temporary power supply installed at the site, requiring the purchase of additional diesel generators that produced more heat while consuming more electricity. By July 1993, before a single inmate had been housed in Tent City, the facility was already consuming twice its projected electrical budget and generating internal temperatures that exceeded federal workplace safety standards by more than 20 degrees. The compound was ready for occupancy. On August 15, 1993, at 6 in the morning, the first inmates were transferred from the overcrowded main jail to Tent City. Local news crews were invited to document the event. Sheriff Arpaio personally escorted reporters through the facility, emphasizing the cost savings and the deterrent effect of harsh conditions. He noted that inmates would be required to wear pink underwear and pink socks, a humiliation tactic he had implemented throughout the jail system. The pink clothing, he explained to cameras, would make escape more difficult and add an element of shame to incarceration. What he did not mention was that the pink uniforms were made of synthetic fabric that retained heat and prevented proper ventilation of body moisture. What he did not mention was that metal bed frames had already reached temperatures that could cause contact burns. What he did not mention was that the morning temperature inside the tents at 6 a.m. was already 87 degrees, and this was August. The hottest months were still ahead. The first day passed without major incident. Inmates complained about heat, but complaints were expected and ignored. The second day, temperatures inside the tents exceeded 110 degrees before noon. 3 inmates requested medical attention for heat exhaustion. The third day, with ambient air temperature reaching 114 degrees, internal tent temperatures approached 130. Emergency ice deliveries were authorized to prevent medical emergencies. By the end of the first week, Tent City was consuming more ice per day than the main jail facility used in a month. The promised cost savings were disappearing into emergency cooling measures and medical responses. But the political theater was working exactly as intended. Local television coverage emphasized the tough conditions and the sheriff's commitment to punishment over comfort. Editorial pages praised the innovation and cost-effectiveness. Voters approved. What they couldn't see was what happened after the cameras left. When the sun reached its peak and the canvas began to bake, when metal became too hot to touch and breathing became difficult, when the desert began to do what the desert has always done, test everything to its breaking point and beyond. The experiment had begun. The desert keeps its own schedule. In September, when most of America begins to feel the first hints of autumn, Phoenix enters what locals call the second summer. Temperatures that briefly dipped into the double digits climb back above 110. The monsoon season ends, taking with it the only source of natural humidity that makes evaporative cooling marginally effective. What remains is pure, dry heat that sucks moisture from everything it touches. Inside Tent City, the inmates learn to navigate this new reality. They learn to wake before dawn, when canvas walls still held some coolness from the night. They learn to avoid touching metal surfaces after 9 in the morning. They learn to ration water, because the portable units that supplied each tent often ran dry before refilling schedules could keep pace with desert evaporation rates. They learned that canvas is not just inadequate insulation, it is an active heat concentrator. During daylight hours, the olive-drab fabric absorbed solar radiation and trapped it inside the tent structure. At night, when desert temperatures typically drop 20 to 30 degrees below daytime peaks, the canvas retained enough heat to keep interior temperatures in the 90s. There was no thermal recovery, no respite, no cool hour when the body could regulate itself back to normal operating temperature. The daily routine became a choreographed dance with thermodynamics. Meals were served at dawn and dusk to avoid the peak heat hours. Recreation time was scheduled for before sunrise or after sunset. Medical calls followed a predictable pattern: minor heat stress in the morning, serious overheating by afternoon, emergency interventions as evening approached. Guards learned to recognize the early signs of heat stroke and kept ice baths prepared in permanent structures adjacent to the tent compound. But the most profound change was not medical or operational. It was psychological. Heat at extreme levels does not merely cause discomfort. It creates a constant low-level panic in the human nervous system. The body knows it is under threat and responds with stress hormones designed to mobilize resources for survival. When that stress becomes chronic, lasting weeks and months without relief, it fundamentally alters behavior. Sleep became nearly impossible. Even with industrial fans running at maximum capacity, tent interiors remained too hot for normal rest patterns. Inmates would lie motionless on metal bunks that radiated heat like cooking surfaces, trying to minimize movement that would generate additional body heat. Medical staff documented widespread insomnia, leading to increased irritability, reduced cognitive function, and a significant spike in conflicts between prisoners. The conflict rate was not what administrators expected. Traditional prison wisdom holds that harsh conditions breed violence as inmates fight for scarce resources or take out frustrations on available targets, but extreme heat creates a different dynamic. Physical confrontation generates body heat that becomes genuinely dangerous when ambient temperatures already exceed safe levels. Instead of fighting, inmates became lethargic, withdrawn, focused entirely on the basic challenge of thermal survival. This lethargy was mistaken for compliance. Early reports from Tent City emphasized the low rate of violent incidents and the general cooperation of the inmate population. What guards interpreted as good behavior was actually a population operating at the edge of heat exhaustion, too drained to engage in normal social interactions, focused entirely on the moment-by-moment challenge of not overheating. The cooling equipment, inadequate from the beginning, began to fail under continuous operation. Evaporative coolers require regular maintenance, water pump replacements, cooling pad cleaning, motor servicing, that becomes more frequent in extreme conditions. When a cooler failed in one tent, interior temperatures could spike above 140 degrees within hours. Emergency repairs became routine, but replacement parts were not always immediately available, leaving entire tent populations without any cooling for days at a time. Diesel generators powdered the cooling units and fans ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The constant noise, a low industrial humming punctuated by mechanical vibrations, created its own form of torture. Unlike air conditioning systems designed for continuous operation, These portable generators were meant for intermittent use. They overheated regularly, requiring shutdown periods that coincided with the hottest parts of the day. Maintenance crews faced an impossible challenge. Equipment that normally lasted months in temperate climates degraded in weeks under desert conditions. Canvas developed tears from thermal expansion and contraction. Aluminum tent frames warped from heat stress. Electrical connections corroded from the extreme temperature cycling. The cost of constant repairs began to approach the cost of permanent construction, but these expenses were classified as operational rather than capital costs, making them less visible in public budget discussions. Water became the most critical resource. Each tent required not just drinking water for 16 inmates, but water for the evaporative cooling systems that consumed dozens of gallons per day through evaporation. Water for cleaning, because unsanitary conditions in extreme heat create immediate health hazards. Water for emergency cooling procedures when inmates showed signs of heat stroke. The daily water consumption at Tent City exceeded the usage of facilities housing 10 times as many people in climate-controlled environments. But the desert is patient. It does not hurry toward crisis. Instead, it applies steady pressure, day after day, testing every component of human engineering until something fails. In October 1993, as Phoenix finally began to experience actual autumn temperatures, Tent City had survived its first summer. Administrators declared it a success. Costs had exceeded projections, but not catastrophically. Medical emergencies had occurred, but no fatalities. The deterrent effect appeared to be working. Crime rates in Maricopa County showed a modest decrease that politicians attributed to the fear of ending up in Tent City. What they could not measure was the long-term damage to equipment pushed beyond its design limits, to human bodies subjected to chronic heat stress, to institutional systems forced to operate in crisis mode as a matter of routine. The first summer had been survived, but survival is not the same as success. The desert was still gathering data. Winter in Phoenix brings what the tourism industry calls perfect weather. Daytime temperatures in the 70s and 80s. Clear skies. Gentle breezes. For a few months, Tent City almost worked as intended. Cooling costs dropped dramatically. Medical calls for heat-related illness virtually disappeared. Maintenance requirements decreased to manageable levels. The tents, designed for temperate climates, functioned adequately when the climate cooperated. These winter months created a dangerous illusion. Administrators who visited Tent City in December and January saw orderly operations, reasonable conditions, and satisfied guards. The canvas walls that became ovens in summer provided adequate shelter in winter. The inadequate cooling systems that failed under extreme heat were unnecessary when ambient temperatures remained comfortable. Everything appeared normal because everything was normal. For 4 months. But institutional memory is short, and political pressure is constant. The apparent success of Tent City during winter months led to expansion plans. If 48 tents could house 768 inmates, additional tents could address overcrowding throughout the county jail system. In February 1994, the county approved purchase of an additional 24 tents, increasing Tent City capacity to over 1,000 inmates. The new tents were identical to the original structures, military surplus canvas with aluminum frames and no climate control beyond portable cooling units. They were erected on the same white gravel that reflected heat upward. They were connected to the same inadequate electrical grid that had nearly failed during the previous summer. The expansion doubled the population without doubling the infrastructure to support that population. More critically, the expansion included female inmates for the first time. Women's physiology responds differently to extreme heat than men's physiology. Lower average body mass means less heat absorption capacity, but also less thermal mass to buffer temperature spikes. Higher surface area to body mass ratios mean faster heat gain and faster heat loss, making women more vulnerable to both overheating and rapid cooling. Medical protocols developed for male inmates in extreme heat conditions required modification for female populations. Those modifications were never implemented. The same cooling equipment, the same emergency procedures, the same temperature thresholds were applied uniformly across all populations. When summer returned in 1994, The consequences became apparent immediately. The first heat-related medical emergency of the second summer occurred on May 20th, earlier than any incident the previous year. Ambient air temperature had reached only 104 degrees, but tent interiors spiked above 120. A 38-year-old woman serving a 90-day sentence for shoplifting collapsed during the midday count. Her core body temperature was measured at 106 degrees, indicating severe heat stroke that can cause permanent organ damage or death. Emergency cooling procedures brought her temperature down, but the incident triggered the first serious review of tent city operations. Medical staff documented that interior tent temperatures were regularly exceeding federal workplace safety guidelines by 30 degrees or more. They noted that prolonged exposure to temperatures above 110 degrees posed significant health risks even to young, healthy individuals. They recommended either installing adequate cooling systems or limiting occupancy during extreme heat periods. Their recommendations were filed and ignored. Summer had only just begun. By July 1994, with over 1,000 inmates housed in canvas tents and ambient temperatures exceeding 115 degrees daily, Tent City was consuming more electrical power than some small towns. The diesel generators required to run cooling equipment and fans operated beyond their designed capacity, breaking down repeatedly and filling the air with exhaust fumes that made breathing even more difficult in the stifling heat. Ice deliveries became a daily emergency operation. Truck after truck of industrial ice was required to stock emergency cooling stations and provide relief for inmates showing signs of heat exhaustion. The ice budget for Tent City exceeded the total utilities budget for the main jail facility. When transportation delays occurred, trucks breaking down, delivery schedules disrupted, medical emergencies spiked within hours, the inmates developed their own survival strategies. They learned to wet their clothing with precious water rations, creating temporary cooling through evaporation. They learned to lie motionless during the hottest parts of the day, conserving energy and minimizing heat generation. They learned to recognize the early signs of heat stroke in themselves and others, because medical response times could mean the difference between recovery and organ failure. But human adaptation has limits. The body can acclimatize to hot conditions over weeks of gradual exposure, but it cannot adapt to temperatures that exceed its core cooling mechanisms. When air temperature approaches normal body temperature, sweating becomes ineffective. When humidity rises even slightly, the evaporation that provides cooling slows dramatically. When metal surfaces reach 130 degrees or higher, any contact can cause immediate burns. Tent City had crossed all of these thresholds by midsummer 1994. And summer was far from over. Guards began requesting transfers out of Tent City assignments. Working in extreme heat while wearing uniforms and protective equipment required constant hydration and frequent breaks in air-conditioned spaces. Even with rotation schedules, heat exhaustion among staff became a regular occurrence. Guard turnover rates at Tent City exceeded the departmental average by more than 300%. The high turnover created security challenges beyond the obvious staffing difficulties. New guards unfamiliar with extreme heat protocols made dangerous mistakes. They failed to recognize signs of heat distress in inmates. They enforced normal procedures during temperature emergencies. They were unprepared for the unique security challenges created when both staff and inmates were operating under severe physical stress. Equipment failures accelerated through the summer. Canvas tiers became common as material expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Zipper failures made tent security problematic. Cooling unit breakdowns occurred daily, leaving portions of the population without any relief during peak heat hours. The maintenance staff, working in temperatures that violated occupational safety standards, struggled to keep basic systems operational. But the political theater continued. Sheriff Arpaio held regular press events at Tent City, always scheduled for early morning hours when temperatures were tolerable and operations appeared normal. He emphasized the cost savings, the deterrent effect, and the innovative approach to corrections. What he did not mention was that those cost savings were being consumed by emergency measures required to prevent medical catastrophes. By August 1994, 1 year after Tent City opened, The true cost of the experiment was becoming clear to anyone who looked at the operational data rather than the political messaging. Emergency medical calls had increased by 400% compared to the main jail facility. Equipment replacement costs were running 3 times initial projections. Staff turnover was creating security risks and training expenses that eliminated most salary savings from the cheaper construction. But the most significant cost was not measured in dollars. It was measured in human suffering that had been engineered into the system as a matter of policy. The desert was keeping perfect records of every degree of heat, every medical emergency, every night, without adequate sleep. Those records would eventually find their way into courtrooms and federal investigations. The experiment was far from over, but the bill was already coming due. I see you're asking me to continue with Part 3 of the Tent City documentary script. Let me write Part 3, chapters 13 to 18. Now, focusing on the crisis period when physics, policy, and human endurance collide. The morning of July 23, 1995, dawned without mercy. By 6 a.m., when guards conducted the first count of the day, thermometers in the Tent City Administration building already read 91 degrees. Outside, the white gravel absorbed the first rays of sunlight and began its daily transformation from mere ground covering into a radiant heat source that would push interior tent temperatures past the threshold where human thermoregulation simply fails. Weather Service records for that day show an official Phoenix temperature of 114 degrees Fahrenheit, but weather stations measure temperature in the shade, at least 5 feet above ground level, with adequate ventilation to prevent heat buildup. Inside a canvas tent sitting on reflective gravel, surrounded by diesel generators and filled with human bodies generating additional thermal load, those measurements become meaningless abstractions. Emergency cooling protocols had been triggered 3 times in the previous week. Ice deliveries were arriving twice daily. Additional medical staff had been assigned to Tent City on permanent standby. Every indicator suggested that the facility was operating at the absolute limit of safe conditions, balanced on the knife's edge between functionality and catastrophe. The desert was about to push it over. Inmate Carlos Mendoza felt the change before the thermometers registered it. 28 years old, serving an 18-month sentence for burglary, he had survived 2 summers in Tent City and developed the hyper-awareness that comes from living constantly on the edge of heat stroke. The air in Tent 12 felt different that morning, thicker, more oppressive, the kind of air that warns experienced desert dwellers to seek immediate shelter. But there was no shelter, only canvas walls that trapped heat like a greenhouse and metal bed frames that would soon become too hot to touch. The evaporative cooling unit in Tent 12 had failed 2 days earlier, and replacement parts were back-ordered until the following week. 16 men were living in a space where interior temperature would exceed 125 degrees before the morning count was complete. At 7:15 a.m., the first medical call came from Tent 36. An inmate experiencing early signs of heat exhaustion, rapid pulse, profuse sweating, disorientation. Standard procedure called for immediate cooling measures, ice packs, cold water immersion, transferred to an air-conditioned medical facility. But medical staff were already treating heat-related cases from overnight hours when tent interiors never dropped below 95 degrees. By 8:30, 6 more medical calls had been logged. Guards began opening emergency ice stations earlier than scheduled, distributing rationed ice to tents where cooling equipment had failed or where concentrations of heat-vulnerable inmates required additional support. The ice melted faster than it could be distributed, creating puddles of lukewarm water that added humidity to air that was already approaching saturation levels. Humidity changes everything in extreme heat. When relative humidity rises above 40%, human cooling through perspiration becomes dramatically less effective. When it approaches 60%, sweating can actually increase rather than decrease the risk of overheating, as the body produces moisture that cannot evaporate. The combination of evaporative cooling units and melting ice was turning Tent City into a low-grade swamp, where dry desert heat that was merely dangerous became humid heat that was potentially lethal. At 9:45 a.m., With ambient air temperature climbing past 108 degrees, the first cooling unit power failure occurred. The electrical load from 47 cooling units running at maximum capacity overloaded the temporary electrical grid that had been installed as a stopgap measure 3 summers earlier. Circuit breakers tripped, cutting power to an entire section of tents just as interior temperatures were approaching critical levels. Emergency generators were started to restore power. But diesel generators produce heat as a byproduct of electricity generation. The closer they were placed to tent structures, the more they raised ambient air temperature around those structures. The farther they were placed, the more electrical power was lost through transmission over temporary cables. Every solution created new problems. Every problem required emergency measures that consumed resources and created additional stress on systems already operating beyond their design capacity. Guards began rotating through air-conditioned administrative buildings every 20 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion among staff. But 20-minute breaks were insufficient for full thermoregulation, and staff fatigue became a security concern as temperatures continued to climb. Dehydrated guards made mistakes. They missed medical emergencies. They failed to follow heat stress protocols. They became part of the problem they were trying to manage. At 10:30 a.m., a 34-year-old inmate in Tent 8 collapsed during routine head count. His core body temperature measured 107 degrees, severe heat stroke requiring immediate emergency intervention. Ice bath procedures were initiated, but the medical facility's capacity for emergency cooling was limited to 2 treatment stations. With heat-related medical calls arriving every few minutes, a queue of critical cases began forming. Emergency cooling procedures require continuous ice supplies, industrial quantities of ice. By 11 a.m., Tent City was consuming ice at a rate that exceeded the supply capacity of every vendor within 50 miles of Phoenix. Emergency contracts were activated with ice suppliers in Tucson and Flagstaff, adding transportation delays and costs that pushed the facility's emergency response budget past the total annual operating costs of a comparable climate-controlled facility. But ice is a temporary solution to a permanent problem. It melts. It runs out. And when it's gone, there is nothing between human bodies and the raw physics of extreme heat except emergency medical procedures that were never designed to handle entire populations experiencing simultaneous thermal crisis. At 11:43 a.m., a power transformer that supplied electricity to the main cooling grid overheated and failed. The transformer had been rated for standard electrical loads in temperate climates. Under the sustained maximum capacity draw required to run cooling equipment in extreme desert heat, it had been operating beyond its design parameters for more than 2 hours. When it finally failed, it took out electrical service to 32 tents housing over 500 inmates. Emergency backup power systems were activated, but backup generators had never been tested under sustained high heat conditions. 2 of the 4 backup units overheated and shut down within minutes of activation. The remaining generators could provide electricity to approximately half the affected tents, leaving the other half without any cooling whatsoever during the hottest part of the day. Interior temperatures in tents without cooling spiked above 130 degrees within 30 minutes. At this temperature, metal surfaces become dangerous to touch. Breathing becomes difficult. Cognitive function deteriorates rapidly. Even young, healthy individuals can experience heat stroke within minutes of exposure. Evacuation procedures were implemented for the first time in Tent City's history, but evacuation requires destination facilities with adequate capacity and climate control. The main jail facility was already over capacity and lacked sufficient air conditioning to absorb 500 additional bodies during extreme heat conditions. The nearest alternative facility was 40 miles away, requiring transportation during the hottest part of the day in vehicles that were not equipped for emergency medical transport. Emergency medical calls increased from 6 per hour to 6 per 10 minutes. Medical staff, emergency cooling equipment, ice supplies, and transportation resources all reached capacity simultaneously. The system that had been designed to operate at the edge of safety margins had finally encountered conditions that exceeded every contingency plan. At 12:15 p.m., with official Phoenix temperature reaching 114 degrees, and interior tent temperatures exceeding 135 degrees, Sheriff Arpaio's office issued the first public acknowledgement that Tent City was experiencing operational difficulties. The statement released to local media described temporary cooling issues being addressed through emergency measures. It did not mention that those emergency measures included evacuating over 300 inmates to prevent potential fatalities from heat stroke. Federal investigators who had been monitoring conditions at Tent City through ongoing civil rights litigation arrived on scene within hours. They brought calibrated temperature monitoring equipment, medical emergency assessment protocols, and legal documentation procedures. For the first time since Tent City opened, external authorities with expertise in extreme heat exposure were measuring, recording, and evaluating the conditions that inmates and staff faced daily. Their preliminary findings were unambiguous. Interior tent temperatures had exceeded federal workplace safety standards by more than 40 degrees. Emergency medical incidents were occurring at rates that indicated systematic health hazards rather than isolated heat stress cases. Equipment failures were creating life-threatening conditions that required immediate intervention to prevent fatalities. But the federal investigation was just beginning. The crisis was far from over, and the desert was preparing to deliver its final lesson in the fundamental incompatibility between human institutions and environmental forces that recognize no authority except physics. By evening, when temperatures finally dropped below triple digits, Tent City had logged 47 heat-related medical emergencies in a single day. 17 inmates had been hospitalized for heat stroke. 4 guards had required medical treatment for heat exhaustion. Emergency ice consumption had exceeded 12 tons, costing more than the daily operating budget for the entire facility. The day that would later be called Black July had exposed every flaw in the Tent City design, every corner that had been cut, every safety margin that had been eliminated, every assumption that human engineering could outsmart environmental physics. The bills for emergency medical treatment, equipment repairs, emergency staffing, and ice procurement would exceed the total construction cost of Tent City. The political cost was only beginning to accumulate. But the most significant revelation was not financial or political. It was thermal. Federal investigators documented that even with emergency cooling measures, emergency ice distribution, and evacuation of vulnerable populations, interior tent temperatures never dropped below 105 degrees for more than 14 hours. This meant that human bodies had no opportunity for thermal recovery, no time when normal physiological cooling could restore healthy core temperature. The human body can survive extreme heat exposure if it has regular opportunities to cool down. Soldiers in desert warfare rotate through air-conditioned facilities. Construction workers take frequent breaks in shaded, cool areas. Even marathon runners in hot climates finish their events and immediately begin cooling procedures. But inmates in Tent City had no rotation schedule, no breaks, no finish line. They lived continuously in conditions that exceeded safe exposure limits, day after day, week after week, month after month. Black July had not been an anomaly or an equipment failure or a weather emergency. It had been the inevitable result of a system designed without regard for the basic requirements of human thermal regulation. The desert had been patient. It had gathered data for nearly 3 years, testing every component of Tent City operations against the uncompromising reality of extreme heat. Equipment had failed. Humans had suffered. Costs had spiraled beyond all projections. And still, somehow, administrators convinced themselves that the problems were temporary. The solutions were simply a matter of better equipment and more ice. Black July proved them wrong, definitively, measurably, with precision that could be calibrated in degrees Fahrenheit and documented in medical records and calculated in monetary costs that exceeded every budget projection. The experiment had failed. The only question was how long it would take for institutional pride to acknowledge what the desert had already proven beyond doubt. The words came in a memorandum dated July 31, 1995. 8 pages of bureaucratic language that danced around the central question whether Tent City could continue operating without causing preventable deaths. The memo, written by the county's legal department and marked confidential, used phrases like elevated risk exposure and operational modifications under review. What it did not use was the word closure, but closure was exactly what federal investigators were demanding. The Department of Justice had opened a formal civil rights investigation into conditions at Tent City. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and federal courts had consistently ruled that subjecting prisoners to dangerous environmental conditions without adequate protection constituted a violation of that amendment. The July 23 crisis had provided measurable evidence that Tent City was systematically exposing inmates to health risks that exceeded constitutional standards. Sheriff Arpaio's response was predictably defiant. In press conferences and media interviews, he characterized the federal investigation as government overreach and political interference with local law enforcement. He emphasized that Tent City housed convicted criminals who had forfeited their right to comfort through their criminal actions. He noted that temperatures in Tent City were no higher than temperatures faced by American soldiers serving overseas in desert locations. What he did not mention was that American soldiers serving in desert locations had access to air-conditioned facilities, regulated work schedules, unlimited water, and immediate medical evacuation when heat casualties occurred. What he did not mention was that soldiers volunteered for their service while inmates were assigned to Tent City by court order. What he did not mention was that military heat casualty rates in desert operations were considered unacceptable in civilian populations and were actively managed through extensive prevention protocols that Tent City had never implemented. The political rhetoric could not change the physical reality. August brought temperatures that exceeded even July's extremes. On August 14th, ambient air temperature in Phoenix reached 118 degrees, the highest reading ever recorded at the official weather station. Inside Tent City, temperatures exceeded 140 degrees in tents where cooling equipment had failed. Emergency medical calls reached levels that overwhelmed not just Tent City medical facilities, but regional hospital emergency departments. St. Joseph's Hospital in Phoenix issued a public statement expressing concern about the volume of heatstroke cases being transported from Tent City. Emergency room physicians were seeing severe heat injuries at rates typically associated with mass casualty events, not routine corrections operations. Medical professionals who treated Tent City inmates described symptoms consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme heat, organ stress, electrolyte imbalances, and cognitive impairment that persisted long after body temperatures returned to normal ranges. The medical evidence was accumulating into an undeniable pattern. Heat stroke cases from Tent City showed injury patterns consistent with exposure to temperatures above 130 degrees for periods exceeding 4 hours. These were not minor heat stress incidents requiring brief cooling and rehydration. They were serious medical emergencies requiring intensive care treatment and, in some cases, resulting in permanent organ damage. Dr. Sarah Martinez, an emergency medicine physician at Maricopa Medical Center, documented 12 cases of severe heat stroke from Tent City during the month of August alone. Her medical notes, later subpoenaed by federal investigators, described kidney damage, liver stress, and neurological symptoms that indicated prolonged exposure to temperatures approaching the limits of human survival. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The conditions at Tent City were causing preventable medical injuries at rates that constituted a public health emergency. But public health emergencies require public acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require admitting that the Tent City experiment had failed. Instead, administrators doubled down on temporary solutions that addressed symptoms rather than causes. More ice, more emergency medical staff, more backup generators. Each solution cost more money and provided less relief than the previous measures, while the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The cost accounting told the story that politicians refused to acknowledge. Emergency medical treatment for heat stroke patients from Tent City was averaging $12,000 per case. With cases occurring daily during peak summer months, medical costs alone were approaching $2 million annually. Emergency ice procurement, equipment repairs, and additional staffing had pushed operational costs to nearly triple the original projections. Tent City was no longer a cost-saving innovation. It was the most expensive jail facility in Arizona history. Equipment failures accelerated through August as components designed for temperate climates disintegrated under sustained extreme heat. Canvas tents developed tiers that could not be repaired without complete replacement. Aluminum frame structures warped and became unstable. Electrical systems corroded and failed repeatedly. The maintenance staff was working around the clock just to keep basic systems operational, often in temperatures that violated occupational safety regulations for outdoor work. Guards began filing workers' compensation claims for heat-related injuries at unprecedented rates. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office had never budgeted for heat stroke among staff members, but by late August, guard injuries were requiring the same emergency medical procedures used for inmates. Staff turnover exceeded 100% annually, meaning that the entire guard force at Tent City was being replaced every 12 months. New guards lacked the experience to recognize heat emergencies in their early stages. They were unfamiliar with the emergency protocols required to prevent heat stroke from becoming heat-induced organ failure. They made mistakes that in normal corrections environments would be minor infractions, but in extreme heat conditions could be life-threatening. Training programs designed for normal jail operations were inadequate for the specialized knowledge required to manage human beings under thermal stress. The learning curve was measured in medical emergencies. Every new guard assigned to Tent City represented a period of increased risk while they developed the expertise to recognize heat distress, understand emergency cooling procedures, and navigate the complex protocols required to prevent crisis situations from becoming catastrophes. But the high turnover rate meant that Tent City was constantly staffed with inexperienced personnel learning through trial and error in conditions where errors could cause permanent injury or death. Federal investigators completed their preliminary report in September 1995. The document, 137 pages of technical analysis and medical documentation, concluded that Tent City was systematically exposing inmates to conditions that constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The report recommended either immediate closure of the facility or implementation of modifications that would bring interior temperatures to within 10 degrees of ambient air temperature. The recommended modifications would have required complete reconstruction of Tent City with permanent buildings, industrial air conditioning systems, and electrical infrastructure capable of supporting climate control for over 1,000 inmates. The estimated cost exceeded $60 million, more than the original projections for conventional jail construction that had been rejected as too expensive 4 years earlier. Sheriff Arpaio's office received the federal report and issued a response that acknowledged receipt without accepting conclusions. The response noted that Tent City was operating within county budget parameters and providing constitutionally adequate housing for inmates. It did not address the medical evidence of systematic heat injuries. It did not address the equipment failure rates that were creating emergency situations. It did not address the cost overruns that had eliminated the supposed financial advantages of tent-based incarceration. But federal investigators were not seeking acknowledgement or cooperation. They were building a legal case that would ultimately force compliance through court order. The Eighth Amendment does not require inmate consent or administrative agreement. It establishes minimum constitutional standards that must be met regardless of local politics or budget preferences. The medical evidence from Tent City provided clear documentation that those standards were being violated daily. Meanwhile, the desert continued its patient work of destruction. September brought no relief from extreme temperatures, only different patterns of heat that tested different components of the Tent City infrastructure. Hot winds that turned canvas tents into bellows, forcing superheated air through spaces where humans tried to sleep. Dust storms that clogged cooling equipment and electrical systems. Temperature inversions that trapped hot air close to ground level, preventing even minimal night cooling. The inmates developed survival strategies that guards recognized but could not officially acknowledge. Trading food rations for extra water, creating illegal shade structures from torn clothing and contraband materials. Taking turns lying motionless during the hottest parts of the day to minimize heat generation. These adaptations were technically violations of jail regulations, but enforcing those regulations during extreme heat conditions would have created immediate medical emergencies. An unofficial accommodation emerged between guards and inmates based on the shared recognition that survival trumped regulations when temperatures exceeded safe limits. Guards looked the other way when inmates violated minor rules to stay cool. Inmates cooperated with emergency procedures and medical evacuations without the resistance that might be expected in normal corrections environments. Both populations understood that they were trapped together in a system that was failing them both. But accommodation could not solve the fundamental engineering problems that made Tent City dangerous. Canvas walls still concentrated heat. Metal bed frames still reached dangerous temperatures. Electrical systems still failed under sustained maximum load. Cooling equipment still broke down faster than it could be repaired. Emergency medical incidents still occurred at rates that indicated systematic rather than random health hazards. By October 1995, when Phoenix finally began experiencing normal autumn temperatures, Tent City had logged over 400 heat-related medical emergencies during the summer months. 47 inmates had been hospitalized for severe heat stroke. 8 guards had required emergency medical treatment for heat exhaustion. Equipment replacement costs had exceeded original construction budgets. Legal fees for defending against federal civil rights violations were approaching $1 million. The accounting was undeniable. The most expensive component of Tent City operations was not housing or feeding inmates. It was emergency medical treatment for preventable heat injuries caused by exposure to conditions that exceeded constitutional standards. The cost savings that had justified the original construction had been eliminated by emergency measures required to prevent fatalities. But the most damaging evidence was not financial. It was temporal. Federal investigators had documented that interior tent temperatures never dropped below dangerous levels for long enough to allow human thermal regulation to function normally. This meant that inmates were experiencing chronic heat stress that accumulated over weeks and months, causing cumulative health damage that could not be reversed by emergency cooling procedures. Chronic heat stress causes changes in human physiology that persist long after heat exposure ends. Kidney function deteriorates, cardiovascular systems become strained, cognitive abilities decline, sleep patterns become disrupted. These changes do not recover quickly, and in some cases, they become permanent. Tent City was not just exposing inmates to dangerous conditions, it was causing lasting health damage that would affect them long after their sentences ended. The federal investigation was expanding beyond immediate constitutional violations into questions of long-term health impacts and systematic medical neglect. The Department of Justice was building a case that Tent City represented not just cruel and unusual punishment, but deliberate indifference to serious medical needs, a separate constitutional violation that carried additional legal penalties. Sheriff Arpaio's political support began showing signs of erosion as costs mounted and federal pressure increased. County commissioners who had initially supported Tent City as a cost-saving innovation began asking pointed questions about budget overruns and legal liabilities. Local business leaders expressed concern about federal investigations that portrayed Maricopa County as violating constitutional standards. Editorial boards that had initially praised the tough-on-crime approach began questioning whether the legal and financial costs justified continuing the experiment. But closing Tent City would require acknowledging that it had failed, and acknowledgement would validate federal criticism of local law enforcement practices. Political pride became a factor in decisions that should have been based purely on constitutional requirements and public safety considerations. The experiment continued, not because it was working, but because stopping it would constitute admission that it had never worked. The desert was indifferent to political considerations. It continued applying steady pressure to every component of human engineering, testing materials and systems and people against the uncompromising reality of extreme heat. Equipment failures continued. Medical emergencies continued. Costs continued escalating beyond all projections. The only question was how long human stubbornness could resist the lessons that physics had been teaching for over 2 years. Winter would bring temporary relief, but winter would also bring time for federal investigators to complete their analysis and prepare legal action that would force changes regardless of local political preferences. The desert had been patient, gathering evidence degree by degree, emergency by emergency, cost by cost. Soon, that evidence would find its way into federal courtrooms where constitutional standards mattered more than political theater. The reckoning was coming. The order came on a Tuesday morning in October 2017, typed on federal letterhead with the seal of the United States District Court pressed into heavy paper that carried the weight of constitutional law. 24 years after the first tent was erected on 30 acres of desert hardpan, a federal judge had finally said what the desert had been saying all along: this experiment must end. The legal language was precise and unforgiving. Tent City violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Conditions at the facility constituted deliberate indifference to the serious medical needs of inmates. The systematic exposure of human beings to temperatures exceeding safe limits represented a constitutional violation that required immediate remedy. The remedy was closure. But closure is a complex operation when you are dismantling 24 years of institutional infrastructure built on sand and stubbornness. Tent City housed 837 inmates on the day the closure order was signed. Those inmates had to be relocated to facilities with adequate climate control and constitutional conditions. Their medical records had to be transferred. Their legal cases had to be reassigned. Their personal property had to be inventoried and transported. The logistics of closure revealed the true scope of what had been built in the desert. Tent City was not just 48 canvas structures and some portable cooling equipment. It was a complete ecosystem of temporary solutions that had become permanent problems. Electrical systems jerry-rigged from diesel generators and extension cables, water distribution networks patched together from portable pumps and plastic pipes, security systems designed for short-term deployment, but modified repeatedly over 2 decades of continuous operation. Every temporary fix had spawned additional temporary fixes in an endless cascade of engineering compromises. The electrical grid that powered emergency cooling equipment required backup generators that required fuel storage facilities that required fire suppression systems that required additional electrical service. The water system that supplied emergency cooling procedures required pressure pumps that required electrical power that stressed the inadequate electrical grid. Every solution had created new problems that required additional solutions that created still more problems. Dismantling this infrastructure was like performing surgery on a patient whose organs had been connected with baling wire and duct tape. Every component was linked to every other component in ways that the original designers had never intended and current staff barely understood. Remove one element and 3 others failed. Disconnect one system, and emergency backup procedures that had never been properly documented suddenly became critical to preventing immediate crisis. The inmates understood what was happening before the guards did. They had lived with the constant equipment failures and emergency repairs for years. They knew which cooling units failed regularly, which electrical connections sparked during high-load periods, which water pumps required manual restart procedures. They had developed unofficial expertise in keeping Tent City operational because their survival depended on systems that were always on the verge of breakdown. But inmate expertise was not transferable to other facilities. The knowledge required to survive in Tent City was specific to conditions that existed nowhere else in the American correction system. The ability to recognize early signs of heat stroke in cellmates was useless in climate-controlled environments. The techniques for staying cool in extreme heat were irrelevant in facilities with adequate air conditioning. The social structures that had developed around shared survival were unnecessary in institutions where environmental conditions did not pose constant threats to human life. Relocation began with the most medically vulnerable inmates, those with cardiovascular conditions that made them particularly susceptible to heat stroke, those with kidney problems that were exacerbated by chronic dehydration, those with psychiatric medications that interfered with normal thermal regulation. These inmates had survived Tent City despite having medical conditions that made extreme heat exposure especially dangerous. Their medical records documented chronic health problems that could be directly attributed to prolonged exposure to excessive temperatures. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had treated Tent City inmates for 8 years, reviewed medical files during the closure process and found systematic evidence of heat-related health damage. Kidney function decline that exceeded normal aging patterns. Cardiovascular stress indicators that persisted long after heat exposure ended. Sleep disorders that developed during extreme heat periods and never fully resolved. The medical legacy of Tent City would continue affecting former inmates for years after the last tent was dismantled. But the most significant medical finding was not individual health damage. It was population-level data that showed how chronic heat stress affected human behavior in ways that persisted long after environmental stressors were removed. Former Tent City inmates showed higher rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms compared to inmates who had served time in climate-controlled facilities. The psychological impact of living under constant threat of heat-related medical emergency had created lasting mental health consequences. The equipment inventory during closure revealed the true cost of maintaining operations in extreme heat conditions. Cooling units that were designed to last 5 years had been replaced every 18 months on average. Electrical components rated for 20 years service life had failed after 3 years. Canvas structures that should have provided adequate shelter for a decade had required complete replacement every 4 years. The total equipment replacement costs over 24 years of operation exceeded the cost of building permanent climate-controlled facilities 3 times over, but the most expensive component of Tent City operations had never appeared in official budget documents. Emergency medical treatment for heat-related injuries was classified as healthcare costs rather than facility operational expenses. When those costs were calculated and attributed to Tent City operations, the per-inmate cost of housing prisoners in canvas tents exceeded the cost of housing them in maximum security permanent facilities with full climate control. The accounting revelation was devastating to the political narrative that had sustained Tent City for over 2 decades. The supposed cost savings had been an illusion created by shifting expenses between budget categories and failing to account for long-term equipment, replacement, and medical costs. Tent City had never been cheaper than conventional corrections facilities. It had only appeared cheaper by externalizing costs to emergency medical services and disguising equipment failures as routine maintenance. Guard interviews conducted during the closure process revealed the human cost of operating a facility that was inherently dangerous to both inmates and staff. Turnover rates had exceeded normal corrections standards every year of operation. Training costs for constantly replacing staff had consumed budgets intended for security improvements. Worker compensation claims for heat-related injuries had created insurance liabilities that affected the entire county correction system. More significantly, guards described a constant state of low-level crisis management that had become normalized over years of operation. Equipment failures that would trigger emergency protocols in normal facilities had become routine occurrences that staff handled without formal reporting. Medical emergencies that would prompt safety reviews in standard corrections environments were treated as inevitable seasonal problems that required management rather than prevention. The normalization of crisis had created a corrections environment where constitutional violations became routine procedure. Guards who would never consider denying air conditioning to inmates in a permanent facility accepted temperatures exceeding safe limits as normal conditions in Tent City. Medical staff who would immediately recommend facility modifications in response to heat injuries instead developed elaborate emergency treatment protocols that addressed symptoms while ignoring causes. As October progressed and inmate populations were gradually transferred to other facilities, Tent City began revealing its secrets. Without human occupancy, the tents became passive testing chambers that demonstrated exactly how extreme the environmental conditions had been. Interior temperatures in empty tents exceeded 140 degrees during afternoon hours, even with cooling equipment running. Without the thermal load of human bodies, the tents were still hotter than federal safety standards allowed for any human occupancy, but the most dramatic revelation came when cooling equipment was turned off entirely. Interior tent temperatures spiked above 160 degrees within hours, reaching levels that would cause immediate loss of consciousness and death in human beings. The emergency cooling measures that had been portrayed as adequate protection were actually the only factor preventing Tent City from becoming a death camp. Maintenance workers dismantling the facility found evidence of thermal damage throughout the infrastructure. metal components warped by repeated expansion and contraction cycles, electrical connections corroded by extreme temperature fluctuations, concrete foundation pads cracked by thermal stress. The physical infrastructure showed damage patterns consistent with exposure to temperatures far exceeding design specifications. The canvas structures themselves told the story of 24 years fighting the desert. Fabric degraded by ultraviolet radiation, and thermal cycling had lost most of its original strength and flexibility. Seams had separated from repeated expansion and contraction. Waterproof coatings had cracked and peeled, turning the tents into heat traps rather than weather protection. The material analysis revealed that the tents had been structurally unsound for years, held together primarily by emergency repairs and replacement patches. Media coverage of the closure focused on the political drama and constitutional issues, but engineers and material scientists saw something different in the tent city dismantling process. They saw a perfect demonstration of what happens when human engineering meets environmental forces that exceed design parameters. Every component had failed predictably and measurably. Every failure had been documented in maintenance records and repair orders. The data was all there, accumulated over 24 years of systematic equipment destruction. The final inventory revealed equipment losses that exceeded replacement schedules by factors of 3 to 5 across every category. Cooling units, electrical components, structural elements, and safety systems had all failed at rates that indicated systematic overloading rather than normal wear and tear. The maintenance staff had been fighting a losing battle against physics for over 2 decades, replacing equipment faster than manufacturers intended while never addressing the fundamental environmental problems that caused the failures. But the most significant finding was not engineering data or medical records or cost accounting. It was silence. As the last inmates were transferred and the last guards reassigned and the last equipment hauled away, Tent City became quiet for the first time in 24 years. No diesel generators running continuously. No industrial fans circulating superheated air. No emergency cooling equipment struggling against impossible thermal loads. Just canvas baking in the desert sun, finally revealing what it had always been. Completely inadequate protection against environmental forces that recognize no authority except physics. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of failure, of time wasted and resources squandered and human suffering that had been entirely preventable. The silence of a desert that had been trying to teach lessons for over 2 decades to people who refused to listen. The silence of physics waiting patiently for the next experiment that would try to engineer human beings out of the environmental equation. On October 22, 2017, the last tent was dismantled and loaded onto a truck for disposal. 24 years of institutional stubbornness ended with canvas structures too damaged by heat and time to be useful even as emergency shelters. The experiment that had begun as a cost-saving innovation concluded as the most expensive corrections failure in Arizona history. The land was returned to its original state, 30 acres of white gravel, baking under desert sun, empty except for concrete foundation pads that would remain as monuments to human hubris long after everyone involved in the Tent City experiment was dead and forgotten. The desert had won, as it always wins, not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient application of physical laws that never negotiate and never compromise. The costs were calculated and filed away in government accounting systems that would preserve the numbers long after their meaning was forgotten. $800 million in total expenses over 24 years of operation. 4,700 documented heat-related medical emergencies. 17 preventable deaths from heat-related causes. 1 federal constitutional violation that required closure under court order. But the most important cost was not measured in dollars or medical incidents or legal penalties. It was measured in the precedent that Tent City had established and the lesson that its closure taught. Human institutions cannot outsource punishment to environmental forces without accepting responsibility for the consequences. Physics always collects its debt, with interest, and the desert always remembers.